Imagine you're alone, stranded in the wilderness, with only the moonlight guiding your every move. Suddenly, you hear a terrifying roar, and before you know it, you're face to face with one of the world's most dangerous predators. Will you survive the encounter? In today's video, we're diving into a heart-pounding tale of survival, where a taxi driver is thrust into a life-or-death battle against not just one, but two relentless threats, the mighty white tiger and a swarm of venomous scorpions. What would you do in such a situation? How would you fight back when the odds are stacked against you? We'll explore the real dangers behind these predators, uncover some fascinating facts you probably didn't know, and break down the events that led to this epic standoff. By the end of this video, you'll understand why survival instincts are your best weapon, and you'll be on the edge of your seat wondering how anyone could escape a situation like this. So, grab your seat, hold your breath, and get ready to experience this thrilling story. Welcome to Real English Story Danish. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales and real-life adventures. Let's dive in. The night was quiet, too quiet. John, a middle-aged taxi driver, sat behind the wheel, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic bounce of the tires on the deserted road were the only sounds that kept him company. His shift had been long, stretching well into the late hours, and the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowed by darkness. Occasionally, he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights in the distance, but there was nothing, just the empty stretch of asphalt that seemed to go on forever. The streetlights flickered on either side, casting long, eerie shadows across the roadside. It was a familiar, unnerving kind of quiet, the type that made the night feel heavier, as if something was watching from the shadows. As the miles passed, a sign finally appeared in the distance. End of route. A small wave of relief washed over John. Almost there. He adjusted his grip on the wheel, feeling the weight of the night pressing on his shoulders. The road was nearly empty, just the occasional tree and the long stretches of dark, unbroken wilderness on either side. The peace felt almost too perfect, too still. John eased off the accelerator as he approached a small roadside patch of grass. The headlights illuminated the soft sway of the tall grass, but something caught his eye, a large, shadowy figure moving slowly at the edge of the clearing. His heart skipped a beat. It was hard to make out, just a dark shape shifting in the night. He squinted, trying to get a better look. It could be nothing, just an animal or a trick of the light. He tried to brush it off, but a knot of unease began to tighten in his stomach. The figure moved again, slower this time, and John's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He wasn't sure why, but something about the way it moved didn't sit right with him. As if to confirm his growing tension, the car's headlights suddenly flickered, casting brief shadows that made the figure appear even larger. The engine sputtered, then stalled completely. "Damn it," John muttered under his breath. He tried turning the key again, but the car made only a faint click. His hands gripped the wheel harder as he desperately twisted the ignition, frustration bubbling up. The silence outside seemed to press closer. The engine refused to start, its sputtering death rattle echoing in the still night air. John cursed again, pulling the taxi off to the side of the road and shifting it into park. He slammed the door shut, hoping the problem would be something simple. The faint light of his headlights barely reached beyond the hood of the car, leaving the surrounding darkness unsettlingly thick. He opened the hood, the engine bay revealing nothing obviously wrong, but before he could examine it further, the silence was shattered. A deep, guttural roar echoed from the trees, so powerful it seemed to vibrate through the ground. John's heart skipped a beat, his muscles tensing. He froze in place, the sound still ringing in his ears. Out of the shadows, two glowing blue eyes slowly emerged, their eerie glow piercing through the night. They were intense, unblinking, locked onto him. John's breath caught in his throat as he slowly looked up, and there, emerging from the darkness, was a massive white tiger. Its body was sleek, muscles rippling beneath the pale fur, and its eyes, those chillingly bright eyes, never left him. The air seemed to thicken with tension. The white tiger's powerful body surged forward, its muscles coiling before launching it toward the taxi. John's heart slammed in his chest as the beast's eyes locked onto him, its growl low and menacing. He barely had time to react before the tiger was airborne, its massive form crashing toward the car with terrifying speed. With a panicked gasp, John slammed the door shut, his hands shaking violently as he fumbled for the handle. The tiger's claws slammed into the side of the car with a deafening screech, metal bending beneath its strength. The sound of its claws scraping against the steel sent a jolt of fear through John, and his breath came in short, frantic gasps. His entire body trembled, heart racing, as he tried to steady himself. The tiger wasn't backing down. Its claws scraped again, this time against the window, sending jagged cracks across the glass. John's eyes darted to the glove compartment. In a desperate move, he yanked it open, his fingers grazing the flare gun. He grabbed it, his pulse pounding in his ears, praying that whatever was left in him could get the shot off in time. With trembling hands, John raised the flare gun and fired. The flare shot out with a sudden burst of light, arcing high into the air before bursting into a brilliant flame. The bright light illuminated the night, momentarily blinding the tiger. The beast recoiled, growling in confusion, its eyes narrowing against the sudden brightness. For a split second, John saw its silhouette retreat, vanishing into the shadows of the trees. John didn't wait. His heart still hammering, he stumbled back into the car, slamming the door shut with a panicked urgency. He fumbled to lock all the doors, his mind racing with the image of the tiger's glowing eyes. The flare's light flickered in the distance as the last traces of its glow faded into the night. He pressed his back against the seat, hands shaking uncontrollably, as he prayed that the tiger wouldn't return. The silence that followed felt suffocating, almost worse than the roar that had filled the air moments before. John wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to steady his breathing. His hands were still shaking, the flare gun's recoil still echoing in his nerves. The night was silent now, but the tension remained thick in the air, like a storm waiting to strike. He forced himself to focus, reaching for the ignition again, determined to get out of this nightmare. The car sputtered a little before the engine finally turned over. A small sigh of relief escaped him as he shifted the gears, but that relief was short-lived. Just as he pressed his foot on the accelerator, a sudden, cold sensation shot through his body. It felt like something was crawling across his foot. His eyes widened in horror as the unsettling, skittering sensation continued, creeping up his leg. John froze. His foot immediately shot up, slamming against the pedals in panic. Looking down, his breath caught in his throat. There, crawling across his shoe and climbing up toward his ankle, was a massive, venomous scorpion. Its dark, armored body and menacing pincers glistened under the dim light. Its tail arched high, the deadly stinger poised like a dagger ready to strike. John's heart raced as a wave of panic flooded over him. His instincts screamed at him to get it off, to escape, but his body was frozen with fear. With a swift, desperate motion, he kicked his foot out, sending the scorpion flying across the floorboard. He quickly yanked his foot back, his eyes still wide with terror, scanning the floor for any sign of more threats. His breath came in short, erratic bursts as he glanced wildly around. The scorpion he had kicked away landed with a faint thud in the corner of the car, still twitching in a dazed state. But that wasn't the worst of it. As he scanned the space, his blood ran cold. His eyes locked on a small crack in the floorboard, a hairline fracture between the seams where the car's frame met the carpet. From that crack, tiny legs began to emerge, followed by more scorpions, dozens of them, their dark bodies creeping toward him like something out of a nightmare. John's mind raced. Where were they coming from? How had they gotten into the car? The sudden realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The scorpions hadn't just appeared, they'd been hiding, crawling beneath the car, waiting for the right moment to strike. The ground outside, the very earth around him, seemed to be alive with the creeping menace. One by one, the scorpions emerged from the cracks in the ground around the car, skittering across the pavement, their pincers snapping in the cold night air. The sight was enough to make John's stomach churn. They were everywhere, crawling up the sides of the car, their black bodies like shadows against the dimly lit interior. His pulse thundered in his ears as he tried to push the horror aside, focusing on the problem at hand. He quickly reached for the door handle, his fingers slick with sweat, but before he could open it, a sharp pain shot through his foot. He cried out, looking down just in time to see another scorpion latch onto his shoe, its stinger buried deep into the leather. Desperation fueled his next move as he grabbed the nearest object in the car, a tire iron, and swung it down onto the creature, crushing it with a sickening crunch. But the nightmare didn't end there. More scorpions kept emerging, their numbers growing, their presence relentless. Panic was quickly replacing his ability to think clearly. John slammed his foot back down onto the accelerator, desperate to drive off, but the car lurched forward, the engine stuttering under the strain. The scorpions seemed to multiply with every passing second, their relentless crawl toward him only heightening his fear. He had to act fast, but what could he do? Trapped in this metal box surrounded by deadly creatures, John's survival instincts screamed at him to keep moving, to get out of this nightmare before it swallowed him whole. The scorpions had taken over. There was no escaping it now. John's heart hammered in his chest as his eyes darted across the car, desperately scanning for any sign of safety. They were everywhere. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them. Their dark bodies were a blur of motion, scuttling toward the wheels, creeping across the windshield, and even crawling through the cracks in the open window. It was as if the earth itself had unleashed them. John's breath was shallow, his palms slick with sweat as he fumbled for his jacket, tearing it from the passenger seat. He swung it wildly, trying to knock the scorpions off the windowsill, the dashboard, anything within reach. The leather fabric connected with the creatures, but their numbers seemed endless. For every one he knocked away, two more appeared in its place, faster than he could react. The feeling of them crawling on him, under him, around him, it was unbearable. He couldn't escape the nightmare. He grabbed at the window crank, desperate to close it, but the scorpions had already made their way inside. One scuttled across the top of the door, its pincers clicking ominously as it neared his hand. With a sharp, panicked motion, John slammed the window shut, trapping a few of the creatures inside with him. He cursed under his breath, his pulse skyrocketing as he realized he was surrounded. The windshield wipers swished desperately, but the scorpions kept crawling across the glass, blocking his view of the road. His fingers slipped on the steering wheel as he tried to maneuver, but the weight of the swarm outside was overwhelming. They clung to every surface, their sharp pincers scraping against the metal, as if they were determined to overrun the entire car. John's mind raced for solutions. Could he drive away? Would the movement shake them off? He quickly put the car in gear, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel and pressed down on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, but it wasn't enough. The scorpions clung to the wheels, their bodies a constant presence under the tires. Every bump in the road seemed to trigger another wave of them, as if the earth itself was rising up against him. Frantically, John swiped at the scorpions on the dashboard, trying to clear the space in front of him. His jacket was soaked with sweat, now heavy from the constant movement, but it wasn't enough. The scorpions were everywhere, under the seats, on the seatbelt, even crawling over the gear shift. With every passing second, it felt like he was sinking deeper into this madness, like the world outside was being consumed by the swarm. His breath became shallow, each exhale ragged with panic. He couldn't think straight. His eyes darted between the windshield and the car's interior, his mind spinning, unable to process the sheer volume of the creatures now inside the car. It felt as though the walls were closing in, each scorpion a harbinger of doom, an unstoppable force that was dragging him down into some dark, unknown fate. He reached for the door handle once more, but his hand froze. More scorpions were crawling toward him from the cracks in the floor, their legs making a soft scratching sound as they moved over the fabric of his seat. He gritted his teeth, trying to stay calm, but every instinct in him screamed to flee, to escape this nightmare. But where could he go? The swarm had claimed the car, and there was nowhere to hide. John could only watch in horror as they continued to pour in, the relentless tide of scorpions moving faster than he could react. The once quiet night had turned into a living, breathing hell, and John was trapped inside, surrounded by an army of creatures, with no escape in sight. John's panic had reached its peak. The scorpions were relentless, their movements swift and unsettling as they continued to swarm the car, their numbers showing no sign of letting up. The constant clicking of their pincers filled the air, each sound sending a chill down his spine. Desperation clawed at his mind, and he had to act fast. He couldn't let them overwhelm him. His eyes darted around the car, searching for anything that could give him a fighting chance. His hand reached under the passenger seat, pulling out the car's fire extinguisher. The cold metal felt like a lifeline in his grip. He didn't know if it would work, but he had no choice. Without hesitation, he pulled the pin and aimed the nozzle at the swarm crawling across the dashboard. He squeezed the trigger, and a sharp burst of foam erupted from the extinguisher. The white foam sprayed in a wide arc, hitting several of the scorpions. For a moment, there was a brief pause as they recoiled, but it was short-lived. Some scorpions fell from the windshield, but many others just seemed to crawl right through it, unaffected. John's breath came in ragged gasps as he sprayed again, trying to force the creatures back. The foam cloud filled the car's small interior, stinging his eyes and throat, but it didn't stop the relentless tide of scorpions. Then, as if to mock his efforts, one particularly large scorpion crawled slowly up the seat beside him. John's heart raced in his chest, but before he could react, the creature was upon him. It crawled up his arm with terrifying precision, its legs brushing against his skin like tiny, sharp needles. He froze, his breath catching in his throat as the scorpion reached his shoulder. In a split second, the scorpion lunged forward, its stinger sinking deep into John's skin. A shock of intense pain coursed through his body as the venom surged into his bloodstream. His scream echoed through the car as his body jerked violently, trying to shake the creature off. His hands flailed wildly, but the scorpion held fast, its sharp tail buried deep into his flesh. John's vision blurred from the pain as he struggled to free himself. He tried to reach up with one hand, desperate to grab the scorpion and pull it off, but his movements were slow, sluggish from the growing pain and the venom coursing through his veins. He could feel his heart pounding faster, his body trembling with each agonizing second. The pain from the sting was overwhelming, but he had no time to dwell on it. The scorpions weren't stopping, they were still coming, and now they had an even more vulnerable target. His breath came in shallow gasps, and every movement felt like it was happening in slow motion. His mind was foggy from the pain, but he had to fight back. The fire extinguisher was still in his hand, though now it felt like it weighed a ton. He pointed it once more at the swarm, spraying it in frantic bursts, hoping to clear a path, hoping for anything that would stop the nightmare around him. But with every spray, the scorpions simply seemed to adapt. They found new ways to crawl, new places to hide. The large scorpion on his shoulder refused to let go, its grip tightening as the venom spread, making his arm feel like it was on fire. He could feel the edges of his vision darkening, his consciousness slipping. His body was failing him, but the fight for survival had never been so crucial. John's mind raced as he realized this wasn't just a battle against the scorpions, it was a battle against time, against his own failing body. The sting was powerful, but it wasn't just the venom that was killing him now. It was the sheer weight of the situation, the overwhelming terror of being trapped, helpless, and surrounded. John's breath came in short, jagged bursts, his body shaking from both the venom and the terror flooding through him. His hands were slick with sweat, still fighting off the scorpions that relentlessly crawled across his lap and arms. The fire extinguisher had little effect now, the creatures were everywhere. He slapped at his chest and legs, feeling the sharp pinch of their pincers, but they kept coming, undeterred by his frantic efforts. Just when he thought he could no longer take it, the deafening roar of the tiger shattered the night's silence. His heart skipped a beat, and his body froze for a moment, gripped by pure terror. He barely had time to process what was happening before his eyes were drawn to the rearview mirror. There they were, two glowing, intense blue eyes staring back at him from the darkness outside the window. The tiger was closer now, moving slowly but with deadly intent. It was no longer hiding in the shadows, but emerging from them, the powerful creature's massive form moving with silent grace. John's stomach twisted into a knot. He was trapped, completely and utterly cornered. Inside the car, the scorpions were becoming bolder, crawling over him in waves. Outside, the tiger was closing in, its powerful presence a threat that John couldn't escape. His mind raced, and his pulse quickened. He was running out of options. The flare gun, which had given him a brief moment of hope, was now empty. There would be no distraction from the blinding light this time. The sounds of the scorpion's clicking pincers and the tiger's low growl combined into a symphony of dread that pressed in on him from all sides. John quickly surveyed the situation. The windows were already covered with scorpions, and opening them could let in more or worse, let the tiger inside. His breath hitched as he thought of the beast lunging through the window. His only option left was to run. But the question remained, could he even make it? His hands trembled as he clutched the door handle, ready to fling it open. He could feel the oppressive weight of time ticking down. The scorpions had become more aggressive now, scurrying across the dashboard and crawling up the steering wheel. A single glance out of the window told him everything he needed to know. The tiger was right there, poised like a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. John's mind screamed at him to act, but every inch of his body screamed in protest. The venom from the scorpion's sting had left him weak and disoriented, his muscles barely responding to his commands. The roar of the tiger vibrated through the car, growing louder as the creature took one step closer, its massive paws softly patting the earth. His heart pounded in his chest as he prepared to make a decision that would seal his fate. There was no time left. The scorpions were everywhere inside the car, and the tiger was so close he could almost feel the heat from its breath. John took one last deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. His fingers gripped the door handle, and he was about to make a move when he heard the unmistakable scrape of claws on the metal of the car's roof. The tiger was circling. John could almost see the bloodlust in the creature's eyes. It wasn't going to wait much longer. Without thinking, he threw open the door and bolted, ignoring the burning pain in his side where the scorpions had stung him. His body was weak, but adrenaline shot through his veins. He didn't look back, didn't stop to think about the danger ahead. The night was dark, the air thick with the sounds of his rapid breathing and the pounding of his heart. The predator outside and the swarm within had forced his hand. It was now a fight for his life. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, John threw himself out of the car, the door slamming behind him. His heart was racing, pumping fierce, heavy beats as he scrambled through the swarm of scorpions. His legs burned, muscles screaming in protest, but he pushed forward, determined to escape the nightmare closing in on him from all sides. The sharp stings of the scorpion's bites were relentless, crawling up his arms, legs, and torso. He could feel the venom coursing through his veins, weakening him with each passing second. But there was no time to stop, no time to think. Survival was the only thing on his mind. The night air was thick with terror, the only sounds the frantic rustling of scorpions and the heavy growls of the tiger as it stalked him from behind. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurry from pain and fear. His footfalls were unsteady as he stumbled over the uneven ground, trying to escape both the sting of the scorpions and the predator that now hunted him. Every movement felt like it took an eternity, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched, of being pursued, drove him onward. Then he heard it, a thunderous roar, the ground shaking as the tiger charged. The sound of its claws scraping against the earth sent a wave of dread through his spine. He barely had time to react as the massive white tiger lunged, its eyes glowing like fiery beacons in the darkness. John's body jerked sideways, his reflexes just fast enough to evade the powerful swipe of the tiger's claws. The air around him seemed to pulse with the force of the attack, and the rush of wind from the tiger's near miss caused him to stumble. He felt a searing pain in his side, the sharpness of the scorpion's stings intensifying with every step. He didn't dare look back. John's eyes were fixed ahead, locking onto a nearby tree. It was his only hope, an escape, a place to hide, even if just for a moment. His legs pumped harder, his body fighting through the fatigue, the pain, the dizziness that threatened to take him down. He could hear the tiger gaining on him, the sound of its breath growing louder as it closed the gap. With every step, the tiger's growls became more menacing, and John could feel its presence like a shadow, just behind him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His feet carried him toward the tree, the rough bark of the trunk now visible in the dim light. John's body screamed for rest, but his survival instincts pushed him forward. He reached out and grabbed the nearest branch, using it to propel himself upward with what little strength he had left. His hands scraped against the rough bark, and his arms burned from exhaustion, but he didn't care. He had to get higher, out of the tiger's reach. He heard the tiger growl again, this time closer, its massive form a blur in the corner of his vision. As he pulled himself into the tree, a sharp pain shot through his leg, where a scorpion had stung him just moments before. His muscles trembled with the strain, but he made it. He was off the ground, at least for the moment. Breathing heavily, John pressed himself against the trunk of the tree, his body shaking from both exhaustion and fear. He strained to hear the sounds of the tiger, but all he could hear was the rapid thudding of his heart. The scorpions were no longer a threat. For the first time in what felt like hours, John allowed himself a brief, shallow breath. But he knew it wasn't over yet. He was still in danger, still trapped between the fierce tiger below and the swarming, relentless creatures that had nearly killed him earlier. But at least, for now, he had bought himself some time. John's chest heaved with exhaustion as he clung to the tree. His legs burned from the effort, and blood seeped from the bites and stings that covered his body. His mind raced, trying to process the situation, but there was no time. The tiger's growl echoed through the night, low and menacing, as it began to circle him. The massive white tiger moved with calculated precision, its glowing eyes never leaving John's weakened form. Each step it took sent ripples through the air, its massive paws barely making a sound as it stalked closer. John's heart hammered in his chest, and his head spun with dizziness from both the venom and the overwhelming fear. Every time he shifted his gaze, the tiger seemed to be closer, its presence suffocating. His grip on the tree tightened, desperate to hold on. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. The tiger's eyes locked onto him, a cold, predatory focus. John knew it was waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for him to slip, to show any sign of weakness. He could feel the pressure building, the tiger's intelligence and patience evident in the way it moved. It was no longer just a predator. It was a strategist, studying him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then, in a split second, something changed. The scorpions, those tiny monsters that had swarmed his car and nearly overwhelmed him, suddenly stopped. Their relentless assault ceased as quickly as it had begun. For a brief, disorienting moment, everything was still. John, barely able to keep his balance, glanced down toward the ground. The scorpions retreated into the shadows, their black bodies disappearing into the dark recesses of the night. John felt a wave of confusion wash over him. Why had they stopped? Was it a trick? Did they sense something he couldn't? The silence felt like a trap, but he didn't have time to think it through. The air had grown still, unnervingly so, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. His hands trembled from exhaustion, and his heart pounded in his chest, but the momentary calm was deceptive. He could feel the tension building again, but now there was something even more dangerous than the scorpions. He looked up just in time to see the tiger, now much closer, its eyes gleaming with hunger. The beast had paused, perhaps sensing the shift in the environment, studying him with unblinking focus. John knew that the tiger wasn't just a mindless killer. This was a creature that understood the rules of the hunt, that knew patience and precision were key. It had been waiting for the scorpions to stop, for the perfect moment when it would have a clear shot at him. Before John could react, the tiger took a slow step forward, its massive paw gently pressing into the earth. It was coming closer, its every movement calculated, deliberate. The low growl that had echoed in the distance now rumbled through the ground beneath his feet, sending a chill up John's spine. John's mind raced, and in that moment, he understood. The tiger had been playing the long game. It had let the scorpions do their damage, let them weaken him further. Now, it was time for the final strike. John's body was screaming from the venom, the injuries, the stress. He felt his strength fading, but he couldn't let go. The predator's strategy was clear: wait, observe, and then strike with ruthless precision. And John knew, in his bloodied and exhausted state, that his only chance of survival lay in outsmarting this beast, if he could. But the tiger was patient, and John was growing weaker by the second. The tiger paused, its massive frame standing still as it locked eyes with John one last time. The predatory glow in its gaze softened, as if it had come to a conclusion. For a moment, everything was still: the jungle, the air, even John's racing heart. The tiger, the fearsome predator that had been stalking him, seemed to sense something that made it hesitate. It tilted its head, a strange recognition flickering in those cold blue eyes. John could barely hold his own weight as he leaned against the tree, his legs trembling beneath him. His body was battered, bruised, and covered in the stings and bites from the scorpions. His lungs burned with each shallow breath, his chest tight from the adrenaline that had kept him alive for so long. Every muscle screamed in protest, but he couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. Not while the tiger still stood before him. For what seemed like an eternity, the tiger stood there, motionless. The jungle was eerily silent, the faint hum of insects and the distant calls of birds the only sounds that filled the air. But the predator, the one that had driven him to the brink of madness, was no longer in attack mode. It looked at John one final time, those piercing eyes studying him. It was almost as if the tiger recognized John's will to survive, or perhaps it was simply satisfied with the chase. Whatever the reason, the tiger took a slow, deliberate step back, its immense body rippling as it retreated into the shadows of the forest. John's head swam, his vision blurry from exhaustion and the toll of the ordeal. The world around him felt distant, muffled, as if he were trapped in a dream. The weight of the moment hit him like a wave, and for the first time since the chaos had begun, John allowed himself to fall. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud. His body was raw, the stings from the scorpions and the scratches from the tiger's claws a constant reminder of how close he had come to death. His arms felt numb, and his eyelids fluttered as he fought to stay awake, the exhaustion threatening to pull him under. But as he lay there, vulnerable and broken, something in the air shifted. The night's darkness began to recede, and a faint light appeared on the horizon. The first rays of dawn broke through the trees, spilling over the jungle in soft golden hues. John's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to breathe. He looked up, and the dark shadows of the jungle that had once seemed so suffocating now seemed to melt away in the morning light. The tiger was gone, the scorpions had retreated, and the terror he had faced in the night was slowly fading into the past. John let out a weak, shaky breath, feeling the tension that had held him captive for hours finally begin to ease. He had made it. Despite the overwhelming odds, despite the savage creatures that had hunted him, he had survived. His body, battered and bruised, was a testament to the fight he had fought, a fight for survival against nature's fiercest predators. As the sunlight filtered through the trees, John closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the new day wash over him. He had lived through a nightmare, but now, with the dawn breaking over the horizon, he realized that he had made it out alive. The terror of the night had been replaced with the calm of the morning, and for the first time, he felt the weight of survival settle in. John had escaped, and he would live to see another day.